Hello and welcome to Conversations on the Creative Economy. I'm Chris Farrell, economics commentator for Minnesota Public Radio. In a series of conversations, we're exploring how leaders promote creativity and innovation in their organizations. Thanks to our presenting sponsors, the Bailey Group and U.S. Bank. AARP is the world's largest nonprofit, nonpartisan, social welfare organization with a membership of nearly 38 million, a staff of some 2,000, and 60,000 volunteers. Like IBM, Google, Mayo, AARP is among America's best-known brands. But just in case you need a reminder, AARP or ARP is famous for telling you when you reach age 50. You get a letter urging you to join the organization, and you get discounts to boot. My favorite comment about this comes from, about the 50-year-old milestone, comes from Paul DiMaggio. He's a sociologist at Princeton University. When asked how he felt about turning 50, DiMaggio said he could no longer be an enfant terrible. He was just content with being terrible. My guest knows AARP. Jo Ann Jenkins is its chief executive officer. She's also author of Disrupt Aging, a bold new path to living your best life at every age. Her career started with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. She later moved to the U.S. Department of Transportation and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. She also worked for several private consulting firms. Jenkins became Chief of Staff at the Library of Congress in 1994 and as Chief Operating Officer in 2007. She became head of the AARP Foundation in 2010 and CEO in 2014. Now, here's a fascinating tidbit. Jenkins has worked for or with every president or first lady since Ronald Reagan. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, I love the title of your book, Disrupt Aging. What does it mean?
So, Disrupt Aging is about how do we change the conversation in this country about what it means to grow older. I hope it's more about focusing on how we live our best lives than it is about getting old. And it really is this whole notion that we really need to challenge the outdated beliefs and stereotypes about what it means to be 50 and older, and hopefully to spark new solutions, both in our own personal lives and communities, and particularly in the private sector, in the way they deliver products and services for those who are 50 and older. And so we're hoping to create this movement. We're all getting older every day, regardless of whether we're a Gen Y or a millennial or a boomer. And this idea that we shouldn't be judged by a number, that we ought to be accepted for who we are, not how old we are. And so Disrupt Aging is about how do we challenge the status quo and allow people to continue to give back and thrive every day of their lives.
So I love it, but if we took a little walk from here, from NPR headquarters, there's a chain drugstore. And if we went to the birthday card counter and it was turning 50, turning 60, turning 70, it's all about frailty. It's failing vitality. It's all, it's all downhill.
I'm on it. Did you read the first page of the book?
You're going to change this. Wow.
The first chapter in my book, Bo Workman, who is my speechwriter and the co-author of the book, and as we were starting to put the pieces together, he said, so tell me when you first really, felt like this whole issue of the age of disrupt aging. And I said, actually, I think it was my 50th birthday. And I tell the story in the book that I don't like surprises. I like to surprise other people, but I don't like to be surprised. And so my husband had arranged for a 50th birthday brunch for me. And we were late to go to lunch. Again, I'm thinking reservations are at 1, and he's trying to make sure that everybody gets there before we get there, and I'm complaining every step of the way about, we're going to be late. What time do they close? How do we get there? He's like, I got it. So we go there, and I have this, 50 of my colleagues from work and friends are there, and I open the cards, and the first one says, you've reached 50, you're over the hill. And every card after that. So I was saying to the staff, we actually should call Hallmark and maybe we should start our own line of cards that really is about positive aging. So it's actually one of the new products AARP is working on of how do we start looking at this 50 plus birthdays in a positive way. But
I like that. So there's a wonderful quote, Leroy Satchel Paige. And, he was still pitching professionally in his 50s and, considering all the obstacles that he overcame. And he said, age is a question of mind over matter. If you don't mind, it don't matter.
Yes.
So you see this now as the push that you're making.
It's a quote I use all the time as I'm doing public speaking because I think it's so true. I think about myself. I'm 58, soon to be 59. I could have retired 4 or 5 years ago with 25 years of government service, yet I can't imagine what I could be doing that I would enjoy more than where I am now. And the idea, and as I'm going out talking with people all across the country, I think the one consistent message I keep getting is that's exactly how I feel. What do we need to do? How do we need to change it? And I tell people that first you need to change your own perceptions because we hold ourselves back in so many ways just by our attitudes about aging, about our own, for women, I know I've said this before of, is she too old to be wearing that? Or, thinking about different little stereotypes of what we self-impose on ourselves about, I'm too old to go back to school. Oh, I need to, my kids are grown and gone. I need to change my habits about, how I go about doing work or how I show up. And so part of this whole disrupt aging and this whole Satchel Paige notion is if we didn't think about age as limiting our behavior or what we could do, what else would we be doing? And this notion of what if we moved middle age from 50 to 65? How might that change our perceptions of what we should or should not be doing at this point in our lives?
So here's one of the big barriers that I see, corporate America or organizations, because there's so many people in their 50s and 60s who are vital, who are engaged, they have a lot to offer. And yet you kind of had this subterranean dialogue about, well, isn't it time for you to retire? We have a problem here. We need somebody creative. We need somebody innovative. And everyone with white hair, sort of like the eye sort of glances and sort of moves on elsewhere into the organization. And so there's this theme that so many people talk about where they feel devalued within the workplace itself. Mm-hmm.
Well, I absolutely agree with you. I think that the future of work is definitely changing. We're fast approaching a time when we're going to have 4 and 5 generations in the workplace at one time. I often think back to my time at the Library of Congress, and we created what were called knowledge navigators. And at the Library of Congress, the average age of an employee's length of service was something like 27 years. So you could retire, but you never left because there was no better place, no better library in the world to work than at the Library of Congress. And yet we had these curators who were not keeping pace with technology. And so we brought in these team of young people out of college to come in and match them up with curators who might be the Lincoln expert in the world, who could tell the difference between whether Lincoln wrote a letter at 6 o'clock in the morning or 6 o'clock at night, or, all of these folks who were leading curators in their field of study. And we brought in these young people and matched them up and showed them how not only could they talk to the person coming through the front door of the Jefferson Building, but through the use of technology, you could be talking to millions of people around the world. And so in the course of several months from, I don't want this person, I want to hold my collections, to can I get another one of those guys to come and help me put my collections up? And I can actually hold a lecture in the Jefferson Building and speak to millions of people around the world on the subject that I love best. And I would say that really taught the whole organization the power of bringing people together rather than pulling them apart, and how we could use the innovation, particularly around the area of technology, to help drive change within an organization. And so fast forward coming to AARP, in the work that I did in the AARP Foundation, we created a program called Mentor Up. And it was this idea of how we could take young people and help them teach an older person how to use their cell phone, how to use that iPad, how to do Snapchat, how to do a video or do FaceTime or with their kids or grandkids. And what came out of that was a what is now a national program that we work on across the country with high school and college students that team up with older people in the community on the use of technology. What we didn't expect is that the relationships grew far deeper than going to the training session, that folks started continuing relationships and going to the movies and taking somebody to the grocery store or helping them around the house. And I think that's the power of bringing generations together rather than pulling them apart. Hopefully we're seeing some strides. We see more similarities between boomers and millennials than any other age segment. They all want to work and live in the communities where they live. They feel strongly about public access to transportation and shared economic models, like in the shared economy with Uber or Lyft or those kinds of things. And so part of Disrupt Aging is not to say, oh, you should be hiring an old person or a younger person, but to say, companies that have multiple generations in the workplace are more productive. They have more fun at work, and they produce better outcomes, because when you're designing for an ageless society, you more than likely will come out with a better product.
And this is a small thing, but I think it's somewhat important. It echoes what you're saying. I've noticed how many boomer parents are going into business with their millennial kids, and that they each are bringing something to the table and they like each other, which is actually a nice thing that the generations are getting along. And I think it's sort of an underappreciated aspect in our entrepreneurial economy.
And I think that's important. I'm probably going to get the numbers off just a little, but more than 3/4 of all millennials cite one of their parents as their best friend. And so there is this influence of buying power and attitude that we see a closer connection between this particular group of people than in any other generations before us. And I think that's important because as you and I were talking earlier, this whole idea of who are you marketing to? How do you sell that product or service? And 95% of all marketing dollars are geared towards millennials, yet boomers and those in the greatest generation have more disposable income than we know our kids or grandkids have.
So are you seeing any change? Because a lot of times when you're talking to people that in marketing and talking about an aging population, automatically goes to frailty, automatically goes to the nursing home. Well, we have these products that you watch on late night cable TV when you have insomnia and you can't get to sleep. And there doesn't seem to be as much energy being put into products that might be useful at work, just might be fun, just might be shared by the generations. See any change?
We're beginning to see change, and a lot of it is coming from this younger generation who are experiencing it in their own families. Company like Hello Alfred, which is a service delivery company, was started by a group of young people who really were having difficulties with their grandparents who lived away, but the grandparents needed someone to come in to help them go to the grocery store, but to put up the groceries when they came back, or to get the grass cut and those kind of things. And Hello Alfred is this online service where you can go in and you can hire somebody to come for 1 hour or 4 hours or spend the day and take care of those kind of things. And those are coming as solutions for how do they help either their parents or grandparents or some other loved one do this. Certainly not enough innovation in this area. One of the things that we're doing and we lay out in the Disrupt Aging book is how do we begin to look at the different industries, particularly those affecting the 50 plus, and disrupt them into thinking about new products and services. So as an example, we're looking at the automobile industry and how many people have had difficulty getting in the car. And I say, if the car seat swiveled, and you could get in and then swivel back in, wouldn't that help a mother with or a father trying to put a car seat in for a baby or a young child just as easy as it would help somebody over the age of 50 try to get in the car seat? How do we start designing products that help both generations? when AARP was doing some advocacy work in the state of California around building safer sidewalks that had access so that people with disabilities or people who had walkers or wheelchairs, our biggest partner in that was mothers with young kids in strollers. Of that access to the curbside entry points was just as helpful to that younger generation than it was for the people who were older. And so getting folks to think about creative solutions. We're also looking at how do you build the housing structures. We've been talking about smart houses for years, but when you get into that bathtub, and if they're designing it for somebody who's 70 or 80, they put that big ugly bar that sort of holds through. Yes. But how do we create that bar in such a way that it is as appealing to a young person as it is to an older person to be able to do it? And the idea that we only like beige and brown in our chairs. So we've been talking with a number of manufacturers of how do we design sleek, sexy-looking house furniture, whatever it is, that really is both appealing to all ages who have the buying power to buy furniture and things in the room.
So you sometimes get frustrated. There's this wonderful picture I was looking at. It was the founder of AARP, and she's with President Eisenhower, and she's showing a home with universal design principles, just what you're talking about, which helps as you age or helps the disabled, but it's designed with the aesthetics in mind. Well, this was during the era of President Eisenhower. Mm-hmm. We're still talking about universal design, but it's still a fringe. I mean, it's there. And you can go to, Dwell magazine, and they'll always have articles about it, and yet it's not part of the sort of everyday construction industry.
I absolutely agree with you. I think the progress has been much too slow. We are seeing some changes in that. I tell people that I really would love for us to get to the point that we're designing the house that allows you to live in your house for your entire life. So instead of getting to retirement and now I need to sell my house and buy one that has the bedroom on the first floor or has the washer and dryer on the floor where the bedroom is or the bathroom is, so that you don't have to go upstairs or downstairs to do that. All those things make sense regardless of how old you are. And so how do we work with the building industry and the appliance industry to create sensible appliances and building products that make life easier for people to live? One of the big things that came out of our focus groups was this idea that if your range or stove was on for a certain period of time and there was no weight on it, could we devise it so that it would automatically cut off? Or I think some of the ones that we've seen the most progress on is the toilet. So now the toilet is higher if you're buying in the newer houses, but 10, 15 years ago, they were much lower to the ground and much more difficult for someone to get up and down for young people as well as older folks. And so we're trying to look at those different industries. We're also looking at the entertainment industry. We do a program called Movies for Grown-Ups, where we celebrate actors and actresses who are over the age of 50 starring in movies. And so AARP started this before I came there. I think we're in our 10th or 11th year, but this idea of celebrating people over the age of 50 in the movie industry. So this past year, we gave our top award to Michael Douglas, and it was a wonderful celebration. And you see these people at the height of what they believe is the height of their career doing their best work, and yet they're not being recognized in the movie industry. And so that work and what we're doing, and the majority of people who actually go to movies are people over the age of 50.
So is this part of an idea trying to change people's stereotypes mindset? Because I participated in a 60-plus improv class, Brave New Workshop there in Minneapolis. No one's ever going to pay to watch me on improv. Let's just be straight out there. But you're seeing improv classes, you're seeing choirs, painting, dance. There's really something going on with aging in the arts.
Yes, and just yesterday, the reason I came here was because AARP was partnering with the local community to celebrate 50 over 50. And one of the recipients talked about the fact that there are over 17,000 artists in the Twin Cities areas. And so we know that our members are engaged in the community. They're very creative. They're very innovative. And the idea that we would put all of this brain power on a shelf and think that they have nothing to give is something that I don't think our country can afford to do.
So you wrote that what's next is the most important question of our time. Why?
Well, I think the first point is that we're living longer. We're living longer and healthier than our parents or our grandparents lived before us. The idea that 10,000 people a day are turning 65, and that's going to happen every day for the next 14 years at least. This is not we think it might happen, this will happen. And with this increased longevity and the idea that for many of us who will be in good health and exercise and take care of ourselves, that we're going to live to be 80, 90, could be 100 years old. And how do we redesign our lives to figure out what our what's next is throughout our lifetime? When we were growing up, most of us had one or two jobs in companies, but they were really the same kind of job. Today and into the future, people are going to have 10 or 15 kinds of different jobs in 3 or 4 different fields. And that we know that future generations like to work on project-based employment, not necessarily being a particular skill set for 40 or 50 years. And so I think it's important that we redesign our education system, because we're going to have to continue to be educated throughout our lifetime, not simply having a 4-year college degree and say that we've completed our education. And we in the nonprofit sector and also in the public sector are going to have to rethink how we're going to attract employees that's going to want to stay with us throughout the course of the lifetime if in fact we're going to be successful. And if in fact we just tack on that what's next after we're 70, then I don't think that's the answer. I think that we have to continue to live our lives and adjust and learn and change and adapt throughout the course of our lifetime.
Oh, got a follow-up question, but first, we're having a conversation on innovation with Jo Ann Jenkins, Chief Executive Officer of AARP. We're in the UBS Forum at Minnesota Public Radio in downtown St. Paul. I'm Chris Farrell with Minnesota Public Radio. So you're head of AARP, 50 and over, and yet what you're talking about is rethinking work, rethinking the way that you have a life that should matter to someone who's graduated from college and they're out there getting their first job, someone who's in their 30s. I mean, this is about changing the way we think the life course.
Absolutely, and it's as I said, it's ageless. We need to rethink how we show up every day in our personal lives, in our community, and how we show up at work. It's going to be a time of, I think, tremendous change. I think that we're going to have to rethink our whole educational system and how we are educating people. I was hosting a forum in Chicago a couple weeks ago with other CEOs, talking to them about innovation and the areas where innovation was most needed. And I fully expected caregiving, healthcare. What was surprising was the number one issue was on skill-based training. And a friend and colleague, Joe Coughlin from MIT, talked about the fact that one of their professors at MIT had put online a course on logistics management. 140,000 people signed up for the online course. Of people in transition trying to learn new job skills, new skill sets, new certifications. And I think that's the wave of the future of how do we begin to rethink and use those skill sets that we may have developed in one particular line of business and make it transferable into other economies, in other market areas, so that we continue to evolve and we continue to learn.
So what does that mean for AARP? So you have that insight, you had that information. What does it mean for AARP as an organization?
Well, I think for us, we want to be working on the issues that are important to our 38 million members. And how do we go about making life better so that people can live their best lives? And so for us, we've certainly been at the forefront of those policy and advocacy positions, whether they're in Washington or whether they're in state legislatures all across the country, of thinking about how do we help our members reposition themselves if, in fact, they've lost a job or whether they've retired from one job. You know, we dropped the American Association of Retired People some 14 years ago, and part of it was in recognition that our members are not retiring. People tell us that they want to work well, not everyone, but a large percentage tell us that they want to work well past 65, whether it's in a paying job or whether they need to take off a year or two and take a break and go back and do something part-time, or whether they want to volunteer. Some people have to work because they need the financial means to do it. Some people do it because they want to work. And for us, we're looking at how we can help our members stay relevant if they choose to be in the workplace, how we can help them keep their technology skills up. Inside of AARP, we have embedded into our culture of our employees and our volunteers this idea that everybody's job is to innovate. And it might be this innovation in a small administrative kind of job, or it might be in the way we think about the future of other programs like Social Security and Medicare, and all of those kind of things that impact tens of millions of people all over the country. And so we see that as our responsibility to learn from the past, but also to be creative and open enough, to be disruptive enough to think about what's going on in society and how we need to adapt and change to meet those needs.
So what do you say to the person, or how do you reach the person who never had a job that offered retirement savings, didn't have health insurance through their employer, low-income job, maybe dealing with racial discrimination, gender discrimination, now they're hitting age discrimination. You say, what's next? A great question, but what does that mean to me?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I would say to you that there are many people who find themselves in that position. And we certainly can't solve it alone, but I think that we try to bring to the table, particularly through the work that we do through our AARP Foundation, which serves low-income, vulnerable people all over this country, and in the work that we do legislatively, not only at the national level, but also at the local level, in trying to help put in place policies and procedures that allow people that access to work, that access to social services that they need.
And
Excuse me.
I know you can't solve everything, but one of the most troubling issues, or among the most troubling
That's
issues...
what my staff tell me. You can't solve everything. But.
...is the racial disparity in retirement savings. Mm-hmm. So rounding out the numbers, about 14,000 for African Americans nearing retirement age, around 120, which isn't great, but for whites. And so as we talk about an aging population and having some resources, thoughts on dealing with the disparities?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me say that those problems don't start when you get to be 50. They really are prevalent throughout our society. And I would also throw in there the gender issues as well. And we know that particularly low-income people of color who have traditionally not been paid at the same level as someone who is a non-person of color, and the idea that women who are more than likely to be the care provider in a household, who may take off time from their place of employment to care for a loved one, that also reduces the amount of money they play into the Social Security retirement system, so that when they become eligible for retirement, their check is much lower than probably their male counterpart or someone, a person of color who's had to do that because of the kind of position that they may have been in. But I think these are societal issues that we need to address early on and not wait until somebody gets to be at that 65 when they're trying to draw their Social Security or Medicare, Medicaid. And something that I think that we as a country need to bring in. I often talk about the 3 Ps, that we each have a personal responsibility to take care of ourselves and to try to be the best citizen we can be, and also to plan financially for your future. That we have to hold our public officials accountable at the community level and at the national level for the policies that they put in place that to make sure that people can live an adequate life. And then that we need to make sure that the private sector is playing their role in designing not only programs and services, but also employment opportunities that allow people in this country to earn a decent living that's going to allow them to be able to adequately take care of themselves and their families.
So now, you live in Washington, D.C., AARP is headquartered in Washington, D.C. There's this conversation that we're having, and yet when you really go to state capitals or you go to the nation's capital, it's a very different conversation. I mean, maybe there's some side conversations in a quarter about this, but most of it is about, we just have too many old people. We can't afford this. They keep getting older.
There's never too many of us. Okay?
So how do you shape that conversation?
I would say to you that people 50 and older constitute $7 trillion of annual economic activity in this country. And I often say, and where else but in Washington would that be a problem rather than a solution? If, in fact, the private industry started focusing on the value that people and the purchasing power of people who are 50 and older, that there are enormous challenges, and I don't want to take away from that as we think about caregiving and the high cost of health care and lack of employment or reasonable jobs that pay a decent income to be able to live off. All of those things are important issues that we need to address. But there's also this opportunity of the wealth of brain power of people who are 50 and older and the solutions that they could be bringing to the table in our schools. We run a program called Experience Corps where we send our volunteers into inner city schools to help teach kids to read from K through third grade. Because we know if you can't read by the third grade, you're almost 60 or 70% likely not to be able to hold a permanent job. And so how do we use the power of volunteers and retirees to go and help some of these problems? We have a huge shortage in the healthcare industry, particularly around caregiving. How do we help recreate careers and possibilities for these folks rather than looking at only the negative sides of getting older in this country? If you think about Japan today, Japan is one of the oldest countries in the world. By 2050, 31 other countries, including the U.S., are going to be older than Japan is today. This is not just a U.S. problem. This is a international problem that we all need to think about how we are putting our policies in place, how our governments function both at the national and local level, to think about how we can use the power of the 50 plus and use this whole concept of not defining expectations about what someone can and cannot do based on their age. So I think I like to look at the glass as half full than half empty.
So for you, you mentioned encouraging innovation within your organization. But you mentioned the word innovation. All Americans love innovation, but we immediately think about technology, right? So innovation is your smartphone, the driverless car that I can't wait till this happens. But what you're describing is innovation in a very different sphere, in the social sphere. So what does innovation mean to you when you're encouraging your employees or working with your employees at AARP?
Well, I think we start first with, I tell our staff that, our job is for every employee to be innovative in whatever it is, the job that they're doing. And we certainly have embedded that into the AARP culture. We've also, in the last several years, focused on how do we co-create solutions with our members and also with the private sector. One of the things that we have now is we have over 1,000 members who have volunteered to work with AARP and companies to have companies come in and test their products or listen to our members saying, this is the solution we need fixed. Or this is in areas in your home, in work. And so that really has been a very refreshing aspect of, and I tell the folks at AARP this, of sometimes we don't know what's best for everyone. We need to be putting AARP in a place that we're laying out the options and then letting people decide the life they want to live, particularly as it relates to work. Some people may want to retire at 65 and stay home. Others may not want to do that. And so our job is to sort of lay out all the options so that people can choose how they want to live and age. We also, this past year, with our board's approval, launched a $40 million innovation fund that JP Morgan Chase is managing for us. And it is to provide seed capital for companies who are coming up with innovative solutions that allow people 50 and older to live longer and live better. And so AARP, I like to say, is putting their money where their mouth is, because we're absolutely out there trying to encourage others to be investing in solutions, and we ought to do that as well. We also launched our own what we call the hatchery. Most people don't know, but our organization was founded by a woman named Dr. Ethel Percy Andrus, and she was the first high school principal in the state of California. And she went to visit a retired teacher who she heard was ill, and she found her living in what was virtually a chicken coop in the back of someone's yard. And that started her quest to go out and find a group health insurance program for retired teachers. So 58, 59 years ago, this woman started the National Association of Retired Teachers, and she started AARP. And it was after 42 times being turned down from insurance companies that she finally got a company to issue a group health life insurance program for retired teachers. And so our involvement in the insurance industry goes back to the woman you saw in the picture with the Smart House, of really thinking about innovation, of how you could bring the power and voice of many to help drive social change. And that's what AARP is about. We are a social change organization with a membership, not a membership organization who occasionally does social change. And I think that's so important, because our work and our innovation is around health security. So not just good enough to have access to health care. How do we help people live healthier, eat healthier, exercise throughout their lifetime, so that when they get to their latter years, they're not frail and they're not uncomfortable at in their latter parts of their lives. We also do a lot of work around what I call financial resilience. So not good enough to think that you can live off of Social Security. How do you stay in the workplace longer if that's what you want to do? How do you learn how to save regardless of how low your income is, so that you don't outlive your financial means? And then that last area, which is around personal fulfillment. How do we get people engaged and passionate about what it is they want to do for this longer years of life that we're enjoying because of the advances in medicine and science and technology? How do we get them engaged in volunteerism, or continue to work, or passionate about the work that people are doing in their communities? And so that's really the areas of innovation that we're focused on inside of AARP. So with our staff, but also co-creating with our partners, and also trying to drive, partner with, but also push at times the private sector who may not be responding fast enough. I know that's a long answer.
Yeah.
I often say that the best innovation was putting those wheels on that luggage. And why was it that we were trying to carry around these 50 pounds
It was a
forever?
conspiracy by
Exactly.
the medical complex, yes. So what you're describing calls for a lot of collaboration. And when I look at a lot of the initiatives by AARP, there's a lot of collaboration there, a lot of interest among organizations, particularly nonprofits, in collaborating with the private sector. Sounds good, not necessarily easy to do.
No, it's not, and I think that it's a particular skill that nonprofits need to learn how to do better, and we're certainly trying to do that at AARP because we can't do this work alone, and it's only through the collaboration that we do with our partners in the community that allow us to do our best work, and I think it's something that is a high point of the work that we do, not only at the national level, but also at the state level, like we do here in Minnesota, of how do we co-create and collaborate and bring partners to the table that allow us to amplify our work. Inside of AARP, I tell the staff, if we're helping thousands of people, that's not good enough for an organization that represents 38 million people, that we need to be making positive change that addresses tens of millions of people's lives all across this country in a positive way.
And how do you hear from the members or your staff? I mean, the numbers get pretty big.
They are very vocal, let me tell you.
They are vocal, but you have 2,000 staff, you have, 38 million members or nearly 38 million members, and of all different backgrounds, political persuasions. I mean, it's obviously it's a diverse, incredibly diverse group. So where do you get your feedback? Where do you get your ideas?
Well, as I said, they are very vocal, our members, in telling us what they think. Some people may not know, but our membership is about 1/3 conservative, 1/3 independent, 1/3 liberal. Rarely does everybody agree on one thing. We get feedback through them calling the call center to tell us what they think. We get emails from them. We have an office in all 50 states, and we have a state office structure that's talking to folks in the community every day. And it is not unusual for me to get 300 or 400 emails a day from average everyday citizens who are members or non-members who can go online and find my email address and send me a note. And most of the time I try to respond back to them or get someone else to respond back to them. But, the older you get, you say what you want to say. Yeah.
My guest today is Jo Ann Jenkins, CEO of AARP. I'm Chris Farrell with Minnesota Public Radio. Now, a large part of your career was in government. And to a lot of people, you mentioned government and innovation. It doesn't exactly go together. But did you learn anything about innovation or what it takes to encourage innovation while you were in government?
Well, I think that innovation starts with people and how you treat people. And I think one of the things that I have learned throughout my government service is that, and I have great respect for people who work in public service, something that I did for a large part of my life. But I also think there's an opportunity for a government to be more innovative and to be able to partner more with the private sector to be able to deliver services better to the constituents all over this country. But I would say to you, particularly at the work that I did as you said earlier, I started my career at the Department of Housing and Urban Development right out of college, where we worked to try to rebuild a whole public housing structure that allowed people some ownership in their communities, even if in fact they didn't own those homes and that they were low income. Of how do you bring into that system some personal pride and responsibility about the housing structure in the community that you live with. I then had the opportunity to go over and work for Elizabeth Dole when she was Secretary of Transportation, and really was able to really be at the forefront of bringing women into the senior executive service inside the federal system. And at the time, we would often say that she was the first woman to head any branch of the military, which was the Coast Guard. And yet we had less than 5 or 10 people, females, at the higher end of over 140,000 people inside the transportation system. And so I feel very fortunate to have worked at a time when we were really trying to promote women. That was back in the mid-'80s into the senior ranks of the transportation system. And then I look at the power of the work that I did at the Department of Agriculture, which was really focused around bringing in small minority businesses, creating competition in contracting, and making sure that those procurement systems that were inside the agriculture system, and agriculture was also with the Forest Service and the Women, Infant, and Children program, a whole vast 46 different businesses inside of the Department of Agriculture, and how do we bring the power of competition and contracting into that large bureaucracy and able to make it work. But I would say at the Library of Congress, we had more innovation taking place in that government structure than any place I've ever seen. That the idea that at the library they bring in some 18,000 items a day into the collections at the Library of Congress, and our task was, how do we sort through and make sense of it? Which things need to be shared with the American people? Because even though it's called the Library of Congress, it really is the people's library. And the idea of how do we bring that, digitize those things that are important and share it with the American people all over the country. And so that Library of Congress actually indexes every book that's copyrighted in the United States. And the library staff, see, I'm giving the speech for the library here as I'm still working there, but have employees who read or speak in 261 different languages. And after the Gulf War, the Library of Congress had the only staff of over 12 Farsi-speaking staff that we lent to the State Department to interpret the telegrams and telemessages that were going on over in the Gulf War. And so when you tell me that there's no innovation in government, I would say that's far from the truth. Is there room for improvement? Yes, but I have great respect for the people who work in public service.
Okay, I just have to ask you, what's it like to work with all those books?
It's great. And in my role as the CEO of AARP, everybody gives me a book. So I have stacks of books that I'm in the process of reading. But, I would say to you that books are important, and whether you're reading them on your iPad or your laptop or on your cell phone, for me, I like to hold the book in my hand. I think that's important to see the content behind it and the thought that has gone into producing the written word. We would always talk about the fact that books inside the Library of Congress is information, and we turn information and knowledge, and hopefully knowledge into wisdom. And I think that's part of what we all need to be doing every day, particularly at this time in our history.
Yes, let's certainly hope that. So I'm not trying to push you out of AARP, okay, but thinking about legacy. Mm-hmm. So from AARP, when you came in to work there, to when you're leaving, how would you like to leave the organization different?
Well, I think one of the things that I'm trying to do now, which I think is so important, is how do we get AARP from being a national organization to being a nationwide organization? How do we move the programs and services that we try to provide at the national level, at the local level, so that people see us fighting for them every day in their communities, in their states, at the national level. And I think our 50-state structure is the beginnings of that, but also we're trying to go deeper into communities so that we're hearing and representing the voice of our members, and not just someone at 601 East Street who's out there deciding what's best for people here in the Twin Cities, but really listening to what our members are telling us that they want AARP to be fighting for and really trying to drive that. And I think that would be a wonderful legacy, and to really empower staff to do their best work. We have some incredible people who work at AARP, and I see my job as inspiring them to do more than they ever thought possible, and also trying to push down the barriers that's keeping them from doing their best work.
And you had mentioned, or I read about, for example, in New Orleans, that you have reached down into the community.
Yes. So one of the things after Hurricane Katrina that was so important to us is for AARP to go down in the community. We had a state office structure there, and staff and family members who lived there in the New Orleans area. And so here we are 10 years later, going into the 11th year since Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in that southern coast. And I happen to be from Mobile, Alabama, and I have lots of relatives in New Orleans, but this was before my time at AARP. But I had the opportunity a year or so ago to go back to the 9th Ward, where AARP decided to not only bring and put our money, but send our staff down there to help rebuild the community center there. That was the centerpiece of what was going on there in the 9th Ward. And what pride I had to go back and see how we had helped facilitate the rebuilding of that structure, but also this idea that AARP had taken upon themselves to train the volunteers about how to be their own advocates in their community. And so I went down to visit for the ribbon cutting, but the highlight of it was listening to the advocacy people tell me how they had fought back for the city council who didn't want the new public grade school to be in the community, and they had fought and got the school to be built there in the community rather than having their kids bust out, and how they had stopped the train from being the train tracks from being put in the middle of their community and having them moved out. And I thought, okay, so now we've created this strong group of advocates. This could be scary, doing this all across the country, but really empowering people who were of little financial means and was really voiceless, and seeing the power of community and people coming together and how they could make a change in their own communities with just a little help from AARP and other partners who had come to the table to let them know that they had a voice in their community and how they ought to use those skills to advocate for what they wanted.
So you told Business Week magazine, and I think this follows right after this, is that one of your life lessons is barriers are only as big as you make them. Mm-hmm. So why is that one of your life's lessons?
Well, I think because, for me, you can either say yes or no. And it is just as easy to put the question in front of someone for them to say yes as it is for no. And that we should not put our plan forth of what we want to do and have it be limited because we're afraid of having the conversation. And I think that's what's so important for us at AARP, to be at the table having the conversations about the issues that are important in this country, rather than to shy away from the conflict. So I'm not necessarily one that's going to jump in to cause the conflict, but I don't think we as an organization ought to shy away from it. And so there are big issues on the table that we need to address, Social Security being one of them. We know that if we make no changes to the Social Security system, that by 2030, everyone across the board will take a $10,000 deduction in their annual Social Security contribution. And how much easier would it be for us to be having the conversation about how do we solve Social Security and making sure that it's there for our kids and our grandkids, and that it's adequate at this point, rather than waiting for it to be at a crisis moment in some 9 or 10 years from now. And so that's the kind of thing that it's look like it. Let's put it on the table. Let's have a conversation. We're not necessarily saying we're all going to agree on what the solutions are, but we ought to be bold enough and have confidence enough and courage enough to really have those conversations about how we need to solve some of these issues that are really going to affect tens of millions of people, and it's not going to get the problem isn't going to get smaller. It's going to get bigger, particularly as more of us live longer and rely on those programs.
And what do you say to someone, say, recently graduated from college, or someone who's in their 60s has lost their job, and both are really struggling to find purpose, to find meaning? They love this what's next question. They love purpose. They love meaning, but they also want some money.
Well, I think that's it's a fair question. I have two recent college graduates. Luckily for me, they are both in employed status, so that's a good thing. But not everybody has it easy. In my home state of Alabama, over 50% of the people on Social Security get the minimum benefit of $1,100 a month. I don't know many people who can afford to live on $1,100 or $1,300 a month and survive. And so we know that we need to all take responsibility for helping to solve some of these issues, whether it's in public service or private sector, or whether it's a neighbor or a family member, that not everybody is having it easy. And so the more job training and job opportunities that we can put in place, I think it helps to solve this problem. One of the things that we were talking about in some of the latest research is that it was saying that it's easier to put someone in a job and train them on the job than it is to send them to school to learn the trade and then getting them to compete for a job. And as we think about so many companies who find themselves having to downsize or outsource folks, how we can help spur innovation and creativity, and how we retrain people or use the skill sets that they've learned in one industry and see what of those behaviors and skills are transferable to other industries. And I think we have to be, as a country, more creative in how we're helping to solve some of our bigger societal issues by really mobilizing this 50-plus cohort to help us solve some of those issues. But clearly, I don't want to give the impression by any means that there aren't millions of people suffering in this country because of underemployment or unemployment.
Well, I could keep going, but the producer is giving me the signal. It's time to bring this to a close. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Wonderful. It's my pleasure. Thank you.
We've been talking with Jo Ann Jenkins, Chief Executive Officer at AARP. I'm Chris Farrell with NPR News. Thanks again to our presenting sponsors, the Bailey Group and U.S. Bank. This event would not have been possible without the work of many people. In particular, I'd like to thank producer Lauren D., Julia Schrenker, Amy Hyatt, Kate Moose, Nancy Cassett, and Mike Resler, and Corey Schreppler. We are taking a break with conversation on the creative economy, but we will start up in the new year. Again, thank you. It's been a real pleasure.